Mr Deputy President, I move today's Remembrance Day motion with deep humility and respect. Remembrance Day is a solemn day to commemorate the sacrifice made in defence of our nation and our Western democratic ideals and values. We remember all those that were lost and those whose families remained in Australia. We mourn their sacrifice with pride and take strength in the example set by their courage and national commitment. On this day, just over 100 years ago in 1918, the guns on the Western Front fell silent at 11 a.m. after more than 4 years of warfare. The Allied armies of the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Canada, New Zealand, Australia and others fought hard to drive back the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. In doing so, they defended the principles we hold dear today of democracy, freedom and equality for all. By November of 1918, the Central Powers had been pushed so hard that they decided it was necessary to call for an armistice while they negotiated a peace. Now, thanks to the Allied efforts, the Central Powers agreed to the strict conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, in effect an unconditional surrender. Now, as many historians have observed, it was less an end to the war in Europe, but more a pause in a century-long European civil war, which would reignite 2 decades later. Excuse me. Since this day, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month has had a special meaning in the hearts of many around the world, at a time when we should pause and give a moment's reflection to the sacrifice made by those who fought and remembered, and in remembrance of those who sacrificed so much for us. The First World War involved over 70 million military personnel, as well as countless millions more at home supporting the war effort. An estimated 8.5 million of those fighting lost their lives in the conflict. An estimated 13 million civilians died due to the direct conflict or disease and starvation associated with World War I. The remains of millions of these military and civilian casualties were lost forever. 17,000 Australian soldiers who fought on the Western Front are among those who are still unaccounted for, 17,000. Their families will never be able to properly say goodbye. So as a state and as a parliament, we mourn with them together. The loss of a grave or a grave far away gave way to our culture of monuments and memorials in towns and town halls and churches we view very much as an integral part of our urban and township fabric today. According to the official rules, those enlisting to fight overseas had to be 18 years old, and those under 21 needed permission from their parents or guardians to go and fight. The national average age of a soldier who fought in World War I was just 24 years of age. But as has become common knowledge now, many of those who enlisted lied about their age in order to fulfil what they saw as their civic duty to defend their home or frankly to be with their mates. The youngest known soldier to lose his life during the war was Private James Charles Martin. He was just 15 years old from a small town in the Riverina region of New South Wales. Today, a boy of Private Martin's age wouldn't be allowed to leave school. And it's believed Private Martin wasn't actually the youngest Australian soldier to fight. Less than 2 weeks after the war began, 1,000 men who had enlisted in New South Wales formed the 1st Australian Infantry Battalion. 2 months later, they embarked for Egypt, following a short stop in Albany in Western Australia. The battalion would take part in the infamous Anzac Day landing at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. Most notably, they were fighting in the Battle of Lone Pine in August, only 1 year after enlisting. For their valiant efforts at Lone Pine, 2 members of the 1st Battalion received the Victoria Cross, Captain Alfred Shout and Lieutenant Leonard Keesor. In Lieutenant Keesor's case, the abridged citation accompanying his Victoria Cross describes his bravery as follows, and I quote, "On the 7th of August 1915, Keesor was in a trench which was being heavily bombed by the enemy. At great personal risk, he picked up 2 live bombs and threw them back at the enemy. Though wounded, he continued throwing the bombs, thereby saving a most important portion of the trench. Next day, Keesor bombed the enemy out of a position which temporary mastery of his own trench had been obtained. Although again wounded, he declined evacuation, volunteering to throw bombs for another company which had lost all of its bomb throwers. He continued to bomb the enemy until this situation was relieved. Captain Shout's valour a couple of days later was described as this, quote, "On the morning of the 9th of August, 1915, with a small party, Captain Shout charged down trenches strongly occupied by the enemy and personally threw 4 bombs, among them killing 8 and routing the remainder of the enemy. In the afternoon, he captured a further length of trench and continued throwing personally to bomb the enemy at very close range under very heavy fire until he was severely wounded, losing his right hand and left eye. He succumbed to his injuries." While these 2 men rose above and beyond the call of duty, their bravery and loyalty to their mates is not unique to them alone. These are the traits of all the diggers who stood side by side on the beaches of Gallipoli and in the trenches of France. And whilst in no way I'm seeking to detract from the bravery of these 2 young men or the thousands of others who fought for Australia, I do take a brief moment to also reflect upon the bravery and sacrifice and the futility of those who fought against them. Following the withdrawal from Gallipoli 10 months later in December 1915, the Australian forces were reorganised and expanded from 2 divisions to 5. All 5 divisions were progressively transferred to France. Until the war ended in 1918, most of the Australian infantry fought in France and Belgium. The line being defended by Allies in this region is what we refer to as the Western Front. Often considered to be a metaphor for the horrors of the war, the Western Front played host to the worst experiences imaginable for our soldiers. Near constant firefights fought in cold, wet and muddy conditions with limited rations and ever-present threat of recently invented chemical warfare and, of course, disease. Running a distance of 760 kilometres from the English Channel near Ostend to Belfort and the Swiss border, the Western Front was the Allies' line of defence, preventing the Central Powers from fully invading France. This theatre of war is where many of the most infamous battles occurred: the Somme, Flanders Field, Verdun and Ypres. This is also where the war would come to an end as the Allies began to push the Central Powers back out of France. Pivotal in this moment were efforts by the Australian forces who conducted so-called peaceful penetrations. These exercises involved Australian and New Zealand patrols discovering poorly defended sections of the German line and, having crossed at these points, approaching the German outposts from behind and capturing them with minimal force. In some Australian units, this became something of a competition, with individual companies competing to see who could be most effective at this tactic. It is reported that this tactic had a significant effect on the morale of the German forces, who will go on to surrender a few months after it became a regular occurrence. One captured German soldier is reported to have said, quote, "You bloody Australians, when you're on the line, you keep us on pins and needles. We never know when you're coming at us." These manoeuvres, combined with the efforts of the Australian forces at Gallipoli, Egypt, Palestine and other Western Front battles, earned the Australian soldiers a reputation of great bravery. General Herbert Plummer, commander of the British Second Army, captured this sentiment saying, quote, "I would like to tell you that there is no division, certainly in my army, perhaps in the whole British Army, which has done more to destroy the morale of the enemy than the 1st Australian Division." In total, 64 Victoria Crosses were awarded to the valiant efforts during World War I, twice as many as have been awarded in all the subsequent conflicts. 15 of those were awarded posthumously. In the first Victoria Cross awarded to an Australian for actions during World War I, it was awarded for valiant behaviour less than 1 month after the landing at Gallipoli. The final Victoria Cross of World War I was awarded for actions taken during the last engagement of the war that Australian infantry were involved in on 5th of October 1918. From the start of the war, from the start of World War I to the very end, Australian soldiers fought with courage and a sense of loyalty to the men fighting next to them. The day of commemoration we know as Remembrance Day was originally known as Armistice Day, the armistice that brought an end to the end of the First World War, which was then thought to be the war to end all wars. And following the Second World War, however, the Australian and the British governments made the decision that Remembrance Day was a better name to commemorate those who served in all wars. In 1993, on the 75th anniversary of the armistice, Australia commemorated a particularly moving Remembrance Day. On that day, the remains of the unknown soldier were laid to rest at the Australian War Memorial Hall of Memory. A 2-minute silence was observed nationwide as the soldier was laid to rest at 11 a.m. This moment, which is etched in my memory, this moment served as a chance for all Australians to share the grief, respect and pride as a nation, stopping whatever we were doing and observing a moment of silence, paying tribute to the men and women who have served our nation and who are serving our nation today. We also pay tribute to the families at home who shared in the sacrifice. Prime Minister at the time, Paul Keating, delivered a memorable speech at the 1993 Remembrance Day ceremony, laying to rest the unknown soldier, in which he summed up what we today consider the unique Anzac spirit, and I'm going to quote a little bit of that speech. He said, quote, "The unknown Australian soldier we inter here today was one of those who by his deeds proved that real nobility and grandeur belong not to empires and nations, but to the people of whom they, in the last resort, have always depended." This is surely at the heart of the Anzac story, the Australian legend which emerged from the war. It is a legend not of sweeping military victories so much as triumphs against the odds, of courage and ingenuity in adversity. It is a legend of free and independent spirits whose discipline derived less from military formalities and customs than from the bonds of mateship and the demands of necessity. Okay. I have mentioned in this place before that this solemn day allows me to reflect on my own family's service. My great uncle Frank Farrer from Badgerys Creek, the only brother of my grandfather, enlisted in 1917 at Liverpool at the age of 21. I'm guessing that would be the earliest point at which consent from his parents was no longer required. On the 5th of September 1918, only 1 year after enlisting, Uncle Frank was killed by shelling at Peronne in the Big Push in the Battle of the Somme and the Western Front in France. Tragically, it was only 6 weeks before the armistice that he lost his life at such a young age. Throughout the generations, my family, like many families, lived with an ever-present sense of loss of great Uncle Frank. However, we were also proud of his service to our country. And in recent years, I discovered that a portrait of a World War I soldier in the living room, dining room actually, of our home at Badgerys Creek was, in fact, not a portrait of great Uncle Frank, which I'd always thought it was, because we had no photograph of him. The picture was put there by my great-grandmother and the family many years ago to symbolise his presence. I thought that's quite telling of grief and love. In a sense, this is what we as a nation have done. The unknown soldier symbolises that person we lost, that we want to remember. He could be anyone's brother, anyone's uncle, father, friend, colleague, or a neighbour, and because of that, he is those things to everyone. We all hold some connection to those who fought for our values of freedom, democracy, and equality, if only by the fact that we are able to experience those things every day here in New South Wales and Australia. With Remembrance Day being held largely on the other side of the COVID-19 lockdowns, it's, at least for us here in New South Wales, it is worth giving thought to the strength of character and the resolve our diggers passed down the generations to Australians of today. Our challenge seems almost insignificant in these times in the face of what those who came before us had to overcome. The legacy of loyalty and resilience they passed down has been one of the biggest reasons Australians have rolled up our sleeves and got on with what needed to be done to overcome the pandemic that we recently confronted, or we are still confronting. We have been inspired by the example of strength and resolve in the face of great threats. I'm again reminded of Paul Keating's speech in 1993. He said, quote, "For out of war came a lesson which transcended the horror and the tragedy and the inexcusable folly. It was a lesson about ordinary people, and the lesson was that they were not ordinary. On all sides, they were heroes of the war. Not the generals and not the politicians, but the soldiers and the sailors and the nurses. Those who taught us to endure hardship, show courage, to be bold as well as resilient, to believe in ourselves and to stick together." I encourage all those who are able to do so safely to attend a commemoration service this Remembrance Day and reflect on all the men and women who have served and those who have made the ultimate sacrifice in defence of our values. You can find information about the Remembrance Day events by contacting your local Return Services League branch. So with those words, members, with greatness of respect and reverence, I commend this important motion to the House.
Yeah.